So I've been playing some new games recently and I noticed how... Wait. Something's not right. What's going on? I'm... Detailed. Oh, yeah, that's right. I got a redesign, done by the lovely Apathematic Reality. Huh. That gave me a bit of a scare. Speaking of poorly shooting segues, let's talk about Resident Evil. While it may not be the first horror game, Resident Evil is what most would consider to be the godfather of horror in video games, along with Silent Hill, and is the series that established what defines the survival horror genre. Isolation, gameplay that emphasizes running from enemies instead of combat, inventory management, puzzles, and a handful of zombie-like creatures to keep the tension up. Since the fourth game, however, the mainline Resident Evil series grew to be more action shooter focused, removing a lot of the suspense that was created from the isolated environment of the Spencer Mansion, in favor of more action schlock camp like suplexing a zombie cultist in order to save the president's daughter. While RE4 has a lot of redeeming qualities, it started a trend that caused the series to lose one of its biggest selling points. As the series continued, it seemed that Capcom forgot Resident Evil's horror origins, with games like Darkside Chronicles being an on-rail shooter that just went through the key moments in the RE storyline, and Umbrella Corps being a multiplayer tactical shooter in an attempt for Capcom to pursue that sweet esports money. So when Resident Evil 7 was announced, I was slightly apprehensive, especially since the beginning hour demo clearly seemed to have taken a lot of inspiration from PT, giving me the feeling that Capcom was continuing to chase trends rather than doing what made Resident Evil such an iconic series to begin with. But I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong, as Resident Evil 7 is one of the best horror games I've played in a long while, staying true to the classic Resident Evil format while evolving it with current gameplay trends. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say this, but it actually feels like a Resident Evil for the modern age. But how did Resident Evil 7 return horror to this franchise? Well, that's what we're going to answer today. Though before I continue, I have to give a warning to those who haven't played RE7, especially the first half, because not only will I be going into some spoilers, but I also think that this game has to be experienced fresh and with as little prior knowledge as possible in order to enjoy it to its fullest. If you came here wanting to know if you should buy it or not, I would definitely give it a high recommendation, as it's up there with Alien Isolation for modern high-budget horror games. So go buy it, and when you finish playing it, you can then come back and watch this video. So with that all out of the way, let's get started.
Welcome to the family, son.
One of the first changes that added to the scares was the setting. Where Resident Evil 1 took inspiration from George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, RE7 seems to take inspiration from horror movies like The Hills Have Eyes, House of a Thousand Corpses, and even the classic Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in which the focus isn't so much about surviving a zombie horde or other movie monsters, but more about escaping from some twisted humans, which is pretty much what RE7 is all about. The continuing objective throughout the game is simply escaping. You, as Ethan, originally come to the bayou to find your wife who's been missing for the last 3 years, and after finding her, your main drive is to get out of the Baker household, which is full of traps, monsters, and old ladies in wheelchairs. The setting being located in the Louisiana bayou, farther south from the Midwestern Raccoon City that the original trilogy was set, makes for a much more eerie atmosphere, as it removes the securities and familiarities of modern city life. Everything on the Baker property having this rusted, abandoned look tells you something's wrong before you even encounter any kind of threat, as well as reminds you that you're alone and nobody's there to help you. I think it's important to note that the imagery of the game also bears a striking resemblance to a certain Konami game. Following in the footsteps of PT, RE7 forgoes the more video gamey look to the previous Resident Evil games, and instead attempts to go for a more photorealistic aesthetic for its visuals. Pictures that are found are scratched and faded, the painting on the walls is peeling, the main house is in ruins and looks like it hasn't been lived in years, food that's left around is rotting and molding. This photorealistic look is due to most of the assets in the game being made using a technique called Photogrammetry, also called photometric stereo, which is where photos of an object are taken in quick succession from multiple angles, then rebuilt as a 3D model. This is how all the assets of the game have such a lifelike quality, and I think it's all the gross little details this gives that makes everything more realistic, which helps become immersed in it. Though it's not only how items look, but how they're placed throughout the house that build the setting's environment, and this goes beyond just dead bodies and animal carcasses. For example, early in the game, before entering the house, there's a news van near the gate that's been clearly sitting for a while. Anybody who played the demo knows this is the van of the documentary crew that were killed off by the Bakers, and having it near the gate in such a rundown condition gives that extra creepy detail to the settings, something that a horror game needs to establish its tone. Then there are the little things left lying about, like a lone boot in the pantry or a ball ominously dropping in the kids' room of the old house, which gives this insidious feeling to the environment. The Resident Evil series has also never been scared of leaving notes and diaries for the players to read through, as well as build an atmosphere, but I feel RE7 takes this to the next level. The dilapidated house the first half of the game takes place in tells the story of the Bakers and gives a little insight into the family. Notes left lying throughout the game not only give hints at what the Bakers are doing to their victims, but at times also portrays them as normal people. While this humanizes them, it also adds to their sinisterness, as you get small peeks into their insanity and demonstrates how unstable they are at the time. For instance, when you look at the notes on the fridge near the dining room, you see how much thought they put into eating their victims, deciding on how to cook them based on their gender and body type. Again, I think it's these fine little details that help create RE7's eerie atmosphere. But a good atmosphere can only do so much for a horror experience. How the player progresses through the game is also a factor. Which brings us to RE7's level design.
You have got a good eye.
While RE7's aesthetic takes inspiration from modern horror games, the level design returns to classic Resident Evil. Along with its more action-focused gameplay, another trend that Resident Evil 4 started in the series was a more linear level design. While you did occasionally have to backtrack to areas to open a door after retrieving a particular item, the maps basically would go in a straight line, with a few branching paths. This style of level design largely deviated from the original trilogies, where you'd be circling through complex multi-layered maps, like one of those Family Circus comic strips, which is something Resident Evil 7 brings back. Exploring the Baker property that you're trapped in has you running through dissection rooms, abandoned plantations, and swamps in order to find keys and other items that can be used to unlock other areas, or open up shortcuts that connect sections of the game. On paper, this type of level design may sound tedious, as you're just being sent to other areas in order to find objects that will let you progress to the next, but since the levels are so open, it lets you explore in whatever way you want. This more open level design lets the exploration be more organic, which helps the game become more immersive, something I think is important to scaring the player. Also, as a result of the non-linearity of the levels, it's harder to predict when scripted events may happen, especially due to the fact that they're not done in cutscenes, instead blending them into the actual gameplay. Except these moments can't be skipped either, so replays can be a bit tiresome. Anytime things get too intense though, there is always the safety of the safe rooms. Like in previous Resident Evil games, these are areas in which enemies can't harm you, so you're given time to manage your inventory or just hide. In terms of pacing, these areas are important not only so that the player can save or use item boxes, but they allow for a break in the tension. If the game tried to constantly keep the player on edge, it would either become exhausting or boring. With this in mind, I found that these rooms were well spaced out across the maps. Not too frequent enough that you were simply running between safe rooms, but enough that you were given a bit of a breather every 15 minutes or so when exploring a new, unfamiliar area. Now, as you progress through the game, you do begin to get very familiar with your surroundings, especially the main house. This could make re-exploring areas lose a lot of tension, as familiarity can be the bane of horror, but the game maintains a level of suspense through the ways areas are lit, the ambient sounds and music, or lack thereof, and moving enemies. You're kept on your toes by molded and other things being placed where there was nothing before, or simply jack roaming throughout the house. This changing enemy placement makes the question of an area being cleared a lot more uncertain, so previously visited areas aren't guaranteed to be safe. There's also sound cues that play when you walk past certain areas that are designed to spook you without explicitly using jump scares. These can range from a simple noise in the background cutting out unexpectedly, to the game trying to tell you where you should be going with loud banging coming from a door. I believe this use of sound design is a good way of building tension, as opposed to how jump scares relieve tension, since you're waiting for something to pop out that may never come, so you're left feeling tense until something finally relieves it. One issue with the level design, however, which is actually typical of most of the Resident Evil games, is that the last section of the game bottlenecks, being a linear, straightforward line, and simply becomes a gauntlet of enemies before the final boss. This shift is rather disappointing, as it undermines the strength of the beginning of the game. Before we get into that though, I think we have a couple other things to go over first, and this is where we have to talk about one of the most important parts of a horror game, the threats.
You thought you'd just slip out before dinner was done?
While traditional zombies have always been a staple of the series, RE7 goes slightly different.
That's not fair. I had zombies too.
Yes, you did. Yes, you had zombies. But this is zombie redneck torture family, see? They're entirely separate species. Like the difference between an elephant and an elephant seal.
Honestly, I think the Bakers are some of the strongest antagonists of the series, as they have a very realistic feel to them. The Baker family being these insane, infected humans living off their victims in a dilapidated house, ties the paranoia that our next door neighbor, that stranger you don't really know anything about, may be some insane serial killer or cannibal. One of the things that makes the Bakers such an intimidating presence though is their introduction. When it comes to previous entries in the series, the first lone zombie encounter is such an established trope in Resident Evil that Shinji Mikami even used it in Evil Within. From the moment you meet the first zombie, you're given everything you'll need, and it's up to you on how you want to deal with this and all later threats. RE7 approaches these earlier encounters in a bit of a different way, however. After the first couple hours, you'll have only encountered a couple of hostiles, namely a possessed Mia and the patriarch of the Baker family, Jake. These earlier fights are made to be frantic and desperate, as you're given almost nothing to defend yourself, and it's these moments that are the most terrifying in the game. And since the Bakers can regenerate, even if you kill them, they will still return to haunt you as you progress through the household, which elevates the fear for your next run-in. Most of the time, it's better to hide and hope they'll go away.
You know I'm gonna find you, right? I do.
Although when you are forced to face the Bakers, you are presented with some of the best parts of the game, and are even given different ways to approach them. Your first fight with Jack in the confinements of the garage is tense, as you can either grab the gun dropped by the cop and fight him normally until he gets into the car and crashes, or you can grab the keys yourself and wreck him with the car until he takes control. In the second battle with Jack, you can weaken him with your weapons until he goes for the mechanical scissors, or you can save your ammo and use the handbags to delay him until he gets fed up and allows you to grab the chainsaw. Marguerite's boss fight in the greenhouse uses the entire poorly lit building for its stage, and basically becomes a game of cat and mouse, where who's chasing who changes throughout the encounter. But I do have to admit that the last two boss fights of the game unfortunately boil down to big dumb monster fights, which have you blasting the monsters until they die with no real strategy to it. These may be very Resident Evil-like boss fights, but they break a lot of the game's earlier tension.
Don't be scared.
The Bakers aren't the only threat, however, as the game needs to pad out the sections separating them. Replacing the standard zombies found in Resident Evil is the fleshy, toothy creatures called the Molded. According to the website Killscreen, to get the desired effect for the Molded's design, Capcom went to a meat processing plant to take photographs of different meats, creating a creature comprised almost entirely of dead animals, and I think the grotesque look that this gives the Molded will likely scare anyone when they first encounter them. Though dead animals aren't the only thing that the Molded are made up of, as it also takes after previous RE enemies. While the Molded appear to look like the Regenerator's not too distant cousin, they also share some similarities to the Ganado of RE4, having a very similar swaying gait to their walk and the ability to cover their face when aimed at, albeit the Molded do have more spastic movements and can be a bit harder to predict when it comes to how they will attack, being able to grab and bite you until you can fight them off. Plus the fact that these enemies are made of this black mold that can be found throughout the house makes walking into any area that is covered in it suspenseful, as you're not sure if and when they may strike. I also think it's interesting how many of the enemy designs and fights appear to take a lot of inspiration from classic horror films. Mia's possessed form is reminiscent of Linda from Evil Dead 2, especially with her use of a chainsaw. Jack also adds a more obvious homage to the Evil Dead series.
That's not good.
Marguerite's boss fight form, ability to climb the walls, and overall insect motif could be inspired by Seth Brundle's transformation in The Fly. The VHS tape where you play as the documentary crew also has a distinct Blair Witch feel to it. Lucas's section where he has you solving an escape room-like puzzle is very Saw-like. The molded could even be inspired by the xenomorphs from the Aliens franchise, especially considering it's implied that those abducted by the bakers are used to make them, similar to how the xenomorphs require a host to grow. I'm not sure if these are intentional homages, or the concepts are just that ingrained in the collective unconsciousness of horror fans, but I think it shows how much Capcom is attempting to get back to RE's horror roots. Though, however strong the enemy designs may be, the lack of variety in them does become a problem, especially later on in the game. There's the base version of the molded, the sword arm version, the fast crawler, and the spewer, basically all of your classic zombie tropes. Once you've faced off against every version of the molded, you know how they behave and move, allowing you to face them in a calm and strategic manner, which decreases the tension of these run-ins. This is why I feel the later parts of the game starts to lose its grip, as no amount of molded that the game throws at you will make the game as scary as the earlier section of the game, when you're desperately clinging to the little ammunition you have to fight enemies you don't entirely understand. Which coincidentally brings me to the next point.
That gun is not going to work the way you think it will.
A defining trait of Resident Evil has always been how scarce it makes ammunition and other items. This limitation is done to make you feel vulnerable, trying to hold on to what little ammo you can find so that you can protect yourself against later threats. So if you aren't resourceful or don't remain calm in the face of the bakers or molded, you will likely waste a lot of bullets, leaving you desperately trying to fight enemies with your knife, doing little damage in the process. This is why at times hiding or running is the better option, as conserving ammo is one of the most important things you can do during the early parts of the game. Anytime you are being given a lot of ammunition though, it's the game basically telling you to get ready for a boss fight or another run-in with the molded, which adds a certain level of anxiety, wondering what you're being prepared for. As you continue throughout the game, the bakers are also nice enough to leave more weapons for you to find. In order to keep tensions high during the early sections, along with having less ammo spread out throughout the levels, these more powerful weapons like the shotgun are balanced by having them take up more space in your inventory. So you have to find a balance between stronger items, ammo, healing items, combination ingredients, and key items, meaning you'll likely have to manage your items quite frequently depending on the area you're exploring. Now, a lot of these are pretty standard for the series, but one of the biggest changes of the combat was the perspective, as RE7 is the first game in the series that goes for a first-person point of view. Previously, RE4 was the first time the perspective was changed from the static third-person view of the earlier games, going to an over-the-shoulder camera, which shifted the way combat was handled, allowing players to have more precise aim when fighting zombies. RE7 makes the next step to modern shooters by maintaining a first-person point of view the entire game. While this loses the clever camera placements of the classic games, the new perspective makes fights more tense as you're put face-to-face with the enemies. This change was also more than likely made to allow for the integration of VR gameplay, but as I haven't played that version, I can't really speak to it. Personally, I think this change of viewpoint was for the better, as it makes for more involved combat, though the new perspective does become a problem when it comes to gauging the distance between enemies, especially since the molded have a long reach with their attacks. For how much I've praised this game though, there is one glaring flaw with it as well, and that is the lackluster final section. Here's a super scientific and not at all made up chart I created to demonstrate how RE7 maintains suspense and scares throughout the game, at least from my experience. If 100 is the peak of the game in terms of suspense, we can say that the game peaks during the first third of the game, up until the second boss fight with Jack, and then continually drops down as the game progresses. This decrease is due to how you're continually given more and more equipment that let you better handle enemies, while the enemies don't really become more challenging or threatening to compensate for this. There's a slight increase during the wrecked ship map, where you're stripped of all your weapons, leaving you in a similar state as the start of the game, but the last section in the salt mines gives everything back and then some before the last gauntlet of the molded and the final boss, causing the suspense that's been built up to plummet, going back to the goofy action of the later Resident Evil games. In the last hour, you're equipped with so many remote bombs and grenade rounds that it's hard to even see the large groups of molded as any type of threat, as it's quite easy to blow them away with a well-placed bomb. If this was a simple first-person shooter, this may be considered good game design, as the pacing of getting new weapons prepares you for facing the final onslaught of enemies, but as a horror game, you're so overpowered, it makes fighting the molded far too easy, so it's hard to see them as any threat to be scared of, which should be Resident Evil's main gameplay focus.
I'm Redfield. I'm glad we found you.
The fuck took you guys so long?
With all of its problems though, I think Resident Evil 7 is a great return to the series. The new settings, story, and perspective allow for a good entry point for new players while keeping to the classic survival horror gameplay that made the series a fan favorite. I can only hope that the next entry will add more changes, as this game felt like a safe experiment more than a bold new entry. With RE7's success, we may also see return of horror from AAA developers, as indie games have been carrying the burden for quite a while. Looking at you, Konami. Like that's ever gonna happen. But hey, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, you can always like and subscribe for more. Also, make sure to follow Apathematic Reality on Twitter, as she does really great work. If you want to see more of me now, you can always take a look at my examination of horror in video games, or if the thing you're really scared of is the truth, there's always my story breakdown of Persona 4. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.